This is a story of mine from a book called The Dead Walk. Weird Tales of Zombies, Revenants, and the Living Dead. It came from, Die Monster Die Press a few years ago. The story is The Righteous Rise by yours truly. I have the privilege of membership as a fellow of the Jesus Seminar, the most publicly notorious arm of the scholarly think tank called the West Star Institute. Our research, shared in popular editions for over a decade with a hungry public, has brought us grateful praise from an audience of seekers dissatisfied with traditional church pabulum, and equal or greater indignation from the wider church public, including one must admit, erstwhile colleagues who hastened to distance themselves from us once we began to expose for public scrutiny the long hushed-up conclusions of critical scholarship. Even within this scholarly fellowship, my own theories have tended to be so marginalized, influenced by the Dutch radical school of the 19th century, that I have learned there is only so much I may share even with these beloved colleagues and fellow explorers into the shadowed past. This, probably destined to be nothing more than a superfluous note to myself, prefaces my translation of an astonishing document discovered a number of years ago by unknown persons, from whom it eventually passed into the hands of John M. Allegro, one of the first delvers into the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the only one not a devout Roman Catholic. Though my own academic career did not overlap with Dr. Allegro's, as a young man I came to admire his work, in some ways more radical than my own is now, and I was thrilled to shake his hand at a conference in Ann Arbor, Michigan, shortly before his death. His early books on the scrolls, some occasionally reprinted even now, are not controversial. His mature work was far more polarizing, even shocking. The sacred mushroom and the cross, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Christian myth, etc. Having come into possession of the document that follows here, he had first thought to prepare a critical edition and make it known to the public, but failing health as well as discouragement over the universal repudiation of his work among the lockstep phalanx of conventional scholars led him to put aside these plans until it was too late. As practically the only admirer, I'm sorry to say, of Allegro's work, I easily persuaded his heirs to hand the project over to me. Once I saw what it was he had uncovered, I began to rethink my resolve. I now see that Allegro must have realized it would have been an utter waste of time to publish the manuscript for the sheer impossibility that anyone would deem it more than a fiction and a hoax. Nor am I seeking publication now as I write. I suppose this brief preface is just to satisfy the curiosity of any of my own heirs who may in future days chance to pick up these sheets. Indeed, such a reader will most likely think the whole thing my own invention. Well, by the time you read this, I shall in any case be quite beyond caring. These are the words... Oops, just 1 second. A little technical difficulty here. Yes. Okay, sorry. These are the sworn last words of Joseph of Arimathea, member of the Sanhedrin of the 50, on whose account the Almighty Power does ever suspend judgment from a sinful world. In the recounting I am about to write, I shall seek to leave out nothing of any weight from such recollections of my brethren as may be required unto the sense of the narrative. You will forgive an old man's inability to recover precise words, though many of them I could not forget, if so I wished. It was the day the death of Jesus the Nazarene was being accomplished, and I lay tossing on my cot. My wife and sons had hidden me in the inner court of the dwelling in case Pilate's men should seek me out during the tumult that shook the city, for not only mortal men, but nature itself rocked and swayed with indignation. Yet of these things I lay oblivious, as visions fueled by the fever rushed upon me like the nightmares of the wicked. Truly it was not fever heat I felt, but the very flames of Gehenna. I danced upon a merciless griddle, and my flesh seemed about to drop away from blackened bone, yet relief did not come to me. I felt as if I were one with that sow that Antiochus, may he be cursed, had caused to be sacrificed upon the altar of defilement. I shrieked, but there was no sound. It was all I could muster to remember my own name. But it was not my own name. In the grip of fantastic mania, I believed myself to be Menandros the Essene. This was not a name unknown to me, but rather of a lamented friend, in his day a member of the Sanhedrin of the 50 righteous like myself. Here was a mystery, that one of the righteous, on whose account the world still stands, committed to the hell of fire, and yet I knew too well the reason for my presence there. But suddenly, as my fever broke, and my forehead bathed itself in a crown of welcome sweat, the pangs of Tophet loosened themselves, and through the eyes of old Menandros I glimpsed not the inside of my own house, but the dank and foul-smelling interior of a rock-cut tomb. The fit of the stone door was imperfect, and sunset rays gave some light to the scene within. My immobile form lay idle on a stone bench cut from the hill wall. My hands began to move first, and it was an easy matter to shrug away the rotting linen bands that had embraced me. I feared to extend arms and legs, lest I look upon limbs ravaged by mold and maggot. But they were clear, bearing naught but the familiar wrinkles and spots I had grown accustomed to in life. Life to which I, or rather Menandros, had now returned. And then I awoke. Beholding my fevered seizures on the cot, my family kept vigil around me for what remained of that dreadful day, now and again one of them creeping toward a window to receive a whisper of the latest tidings. So strange and distressing were these that I knew not what to credit. Had tale-bearers already been at work embellishing them? One said that mild quaking shook the earth, the which I too had felt, though at the time I did imagine these tremors to be part of my dreams. Pilate's men might still be observed roaming the narrow cobbled streets, but they seemed now more intent on keeping general order than in rounding up those who had confessed faith in Jesus as King of the Jews. Of these I was commonly believed to be one, as so I was, save that I knew there was rather more to the Nazarene than most thought. My fever returned about the 3rd hour. I dreamed again, and once more I was not myself, but took the name of another of my old fellows of the 50, another man whose loss I had mourned these last years, Arimathea of Soko. I felt no heat this time, but rather a great parching of the throat, like a man wandering long in the wilderness. But wandering was denied me, for I was bound, my feet tied to some boulder or weight below me, in a depth of water stopping just above my wetted beard. The water around me was clear, clearer than the lake of Gennesaret, so that passing fishes were easily to be seen. Some paid me a moment's curious regard as they swam past my ungainly twistings and turnings, all in the effort to lower my chin and lap up some of the delicious water. But naught availed. Just above my head, like refreshing drops of rain, suspended by some magic, hung ripe and luscious fruits. I craned my neck till it pained me greatly, and still I found no means of satisfying thirst and hunger. And throughout all was the rueful memory that it might always have been so, and the leaden certainty that it should always be so, and the self-reproach for what I had done to place myself, or rather Arimathea, thinking with his thoughts in such a place. But at once there was a change, and I felt a welcome sense of free movement. I heard at some distance the common sound as of a clay pot shattering upon impact as if thrown from a window, and then I felt no wetness and no binding of my limbs. Still I thirsted, but it was no more such agony. I sat up from the dusty ground, clearing away sharp shards of clay which pricked my back, and I saw through the gloom a line of irregular glazed jars, all about the same size, with names and holy symbols emblazed thereon. They were ossuaries containing the bones of the dead. I whispered thanks to the angels and got up, testing the strength of my spindly legs. The door was not hard to open, and I, which is to say Abramelin, slipped into the night, heading instinctively for the holy city as if in answer to some call. My niece Tabitha caught me walking in my sleep and woke me from this dream. She was not much distressed, having learned over many years to expect the strange from her old Uncle Joseph. The rest of my relations were just returning from outside, where the darkness had emboldened them to venture. And yet it was not night time. From nowhere, it seemed, an eclipse had eaten the sun. Unwelcome in the season of Passover, when the full moon ought to be visible, the prodigy augured divine displeasure. But beyond this, whispered opinions divided. Was the Most High showing his displeasure against the blasphemer Jesus, or against those who had persecuted this prophet of God? That each man must decide for himself, or so Jesus would have said. Helping me back to a bed whose clammy touch I would as well escape, my sister and her daughter charged me to lie there and regain my strength. How could I tried to reason them, when my friend must soon breathe his last atop the lonely gallows hill of Golgotha, so named for the circle of standing stones amid which the latter-day Romans had taken to crucifying their Jewish subjects. None the less I drifted again into fitful sleep. As I did so, I thought I heard the fearful whispers of those about me that new and more terrifying reports had filtered in from passers-by. For in the unnatural darkness that banished the day, the priests and Levites had in alarm sought the counsel of the Most High in the temple sanctuary, offering sacrifice and chanting psalms. And after they had so performed for an hour or so, as if in answer to their displays, the great veil of purple, blue, and scarlet, whose topmost section was woven with gold in the form of laden grapevines, began to split open without visible cause from top to bottom, revealing the forbidden inner sanctum. Here none but the high priest dares enter, and even then but once a year, to offer the blood of atonement. The priests on duty, it was said, stopped in their tracks. They caught a glimpse of what lay within and fled in terror, precipitating a stampede of the gathered crowd, which not even the temple police were able to stop. More Roman troops were called forth from the adjacent Antonia fortress to make sure the fleeing crowd did not ignite into riot, but they found themselves less than eager to intervene when reports began to reach them from still other panicked Jerusalemites that certain familiar faces of the sainted dead were being recognized here and there throughout the city. I knew as I heard these bedside mutterings that they must be the product of my fever madness. And yet as I plunged deeper into sleep's enfolding layers, I felt that I understood even the strangest of what was happening on this fateful day. Now I saw before me, sitting by her fire, the wizened, toothless face of a woman who was no relation of mine. No relation to Joseph, that is. But she was known to me at that moment, for she was the old mother of Nectabanus the sage, dead these last 3 years, and I was Nectabanus. Her distress showed widely across her face, and she asked me, asking Nectabanus, why the sun should be dark at such a time of day, and why her son should be alive again. I know not what he may have told her as I took my leave of their company at this juncture, but I was beginning to think I knew the answer to her questions. 3 tau marks stood etched crudely against the sky. Darker blurs against the gray void, drained of the sun at the very height of midday. 2 silent forms gathered their strength to hold on to another useless hour of life. The man between them mumbled something, perhaps words of scripture, to comfort himself on this, the crumbling ledge of eternity. The 3 of them were all but naked, mere strips half protecting their forgotten modesty. Each alike was tied with abrasive rope to the crossbeam. What visibly distinguished the others from the man in the middle was the laurel wreath of nail-length thorns twisted gingerly into this particular shape and perched atop his pock-marked scalp. Mingled blood and sweat flowed down to irritate the wretch, so that he now and again shook his head feebly from side to shake off the stinging, salty fluid. Watchful Roman eyes were fixed upon this man from below, where a centurion, despising his task, waited for these scarecrows to die. He had derived some small amusement a couple of hours before, when the two men on the ends traded insults to one another, chiefly crude remarks about each other's genital endowments. Their bravado had ceased when the sunlight was eclipsed in some unnatural fashion. Now he listened carefully to the middle figure, who had begun to speak only once the light was gone. The Roman held his hastily lit lantern aloft and focused on the bruised lips of the torture victim, seeking to read the stammered Aramaic that fell from them now and then. He idly wondered if one so close to the lip of the next world might see something and try to forewarn the living. He could make out little, but he did notice, of a sudden, that with one of the man's periodic attempts to shake away the sweat in his eyes, his mock crown had almost been dislodged. For some reason, the centurion felt this must not be allowed to happen, and he set down the lantern, tried to make sure of his mark, and hoisted his lance up to push the crown back into a more secure position with the sharp tip of his spear. What he could not see for the deep shadows was that his spear point had raked the forehead of the crucified man. Something else he could not see was a short line of what would have appeared to be healed scars, just at his hairline, forming the Hebrew word emet, truth or faithfulness. Little did the Roman know his lance head had nicked the flesh to the right of this scar, omitting the tiny rightmost letter. In an instant the man slumped dead, no more fighting half-heartedly for breath. The centurion thought it odd and hoped Pilate would not think he had somehow killed the man before his sentence of suffering was complete. And then he noticed it was growing lighter. Some measure of composure returned to my family once the light of the sun was restored about the 9th hour. The quaking of the earth had subsided as well, and word reached us that Jesus the Nazarene was dead, mercifully dead given the design of crucifixion to kill its victims from exposure over several days' time. Things seemed to be returning to normal, save for one lingering shadow of nightmare. Rumors persisted that many of the righteous of past days had been seen alive again in or nearby the places they had once dwelt, received alternately with terror or delight, as at the return of one long prodigal. And every name was known to me. They were my brethren of the Sanhedrin of the 50 righteous, on whose behalf the world continued, ever since the Holy One of Israel did swear unto our father Abraham that he should not destroy the cities of the plain, if 50 righteous should be found within. The angel of death had thinned our ranks in recent years, till I was the last left alive. I rose from my sick bed, now, in truth, feeling much invigorated, perhaps from determination, and I brooked none of the attempts of my loved ones to hinder me. It was not the first such occasion. Now, as before, I wended my way as rapidly as my old limbs would take me through the winding alleys in the oldest portion of the city, that in which the unclean ruins of the shrines of ancient Jebusite gods used to stand, and where rock-strewn passages yet opened upon nether secrets, provided one knew where to look for them. And I did. All the 50 had known. And as I carefully sought each precarious step, I recalled the equally dangerous steps that had led to my previous course of action and its present aftermath. Some 3 years before, when the 50 righteous were convened in prayer and advisement, I did mourn greatly, and another inquired of me, "O Joseph, pray tell, wherefore is thy countenance fallen?" In truth, I had grown thus somber following the reporting of several of our number who, as was their wont, spent the year traveling to and fro through the earth. Our own lot was to act as salt, savoring the world with a view toward making the same pleasing to God. If not, the world should still go on despite the magnitude of its sins, but our role would be little more than that of hostages, for whose sake, because of his ancient promise, the Almighty must needs spare mankind. And I, for one, was greatly crestfallen at the state of things, at the plague of evil and oppression that stretched like the empire of the evil one across the boundaries of Rome, Parthia, Hind, Cathay, and whatever other lands might exist in God's wide knowledge. I voiced among my brethren the hitherto unspoken fear that such a world might one day be found not to yield so scant a harvest as 50 righteous in a single generation. Our ranks were old and gray-bearded, with few on the horizon to replenish us. We must, I urged, undertake bold measures to purify the world in the sight of God, lest worse come to worst and all be lost. If God had ordained us as captains of a ship now tossing amid a great storm, surely our task was to find a means to see the ship safe into port, not to witness its final disappearance beneath the churning waves. All were weary as I was, and though weariness often brings with it a paralyzing complacency, these were the 50 righteous, and they did not ignore my pleas. The question was what precisely we might do. If my diagnosis was not controversial, the same cannot be said for my prescription. I had devoted much study to the Scriptures until I concluded that much power might lie idle and dormant until some mighty man of valor should step forth to don the mantle of history, even as Saul and Jephthah and Gideon before us. They too lived in trying times, times when their people, though full of vigor, yet languished for the lack of any firebrand to ignite it. We, the 50, ought, I judge, to anoint such a champion who might draw upon the forces with which God had endowed us, and to act mightily and heroically in ways closed to a group of aging and secret adepts. In recent years, many had instinctively looked to men of the stature of Athronges, the shepherd king, and of John the Baptist to fill such a role, but these were struck down too easily by the mighty fist of Rome. Nay, the times required one with visible powers that should give a clear sign of the presence of God among men. And thus I propose that we create us a champion such as we sought. There was a way, as all knew. I had come to the meeting prepared, and now I brought forth the hoary scroll of Yetzirah, a collection of secrets surviving from before the flood, formulae bequeathed to the Nephilim by their fathers, the fallen sons of Elion. There were others like it housed in the repository where we met, the venerable book of Raziel, which Noah received from the archangel Raphael, containing cures for every illness, the terrifying stellae of Seth, of which none ever speaketh, the dreaded key of Shalmanu, which Solomon stole away to summon the demons to build him a temple against the will of God. But I knew the Sefer Yetzirah held the secrets used by the Almighty Creator himself to make mankind, and which might with trepidation be employed likewise to repeat that endeavor. And so I proposed to the assembly. Much debate followed. Several of the brethren begged time to familiarize themselves with the contents of the writing, which they had hitherto shunned, considering it blasphemy. It was a matter of months before we met again to reach a consensus, and yet more months before we had prepared the needful ingredients and arrangements, which I may not set down here. But at length there beneath the streets of ancient Salem, even Jebusite Jerusalem, which once did echo the sandaled feet of Melchizedek, there lay before us the roughly molded clay homunculus, a puppet-like suggestion of the form of man. It reclined in a shallow tub of water enriched with divers substances. Chalk symbols ringed the basin, while corpse-fat candlesticks ringed these at a further distance. The head was propped so that the face from the cheekbones to the scalp line was exposed. I had stooped down to engrave in the firm clay 4 letters, E-M-E-T, truth. This word of power should impart life and power to the golem we had formed, and whom no man might stop save by effacing again the first of the letters, reducing the word to met, death. On this one we would set our hope. Into this one we had contrived to transfer our powers and vitalities, that he might succeed in saving a world which we had grown too old and tired to save. I rose to my feet, and my friend Hibil-Ziwa handed me the text of Yetzirah, from which I read slowly. And the mighty angels each did take of his own virtues, and combine them into the form of a man, which they had made from the clay of the bed of the river of life. And they breathed life into what they had made, saying, He shall be called Enosh, for he is the first of men. And a voice did sound from the four-faced one seated on the sapphire throne, saying, Let all God's angels worship him. Whereupon I did make the final needful gesture, and all of us did kneel, our old bones creaking, to the rough chamber floor. And as we knelt, the figure within the circle did slowly rise, his eyes glowing with wisdom and power. And I feared much to speak now, but I must, saying, You are like the man, though you are made by man. Hence you shall be called Bar-Enosh, the Son of Man. He turned to look at me with magnanimity. Tripping only once or twice, distracted by memories, I succeeded in descending unto the adytum I sought, and once there, recollection melded seamlessly with reality, for here, as accustomed, were the restored circle of the 50 righteous, and I was unsure for the moment whether perhaps again I dreamed upon my sick bed. But no, the forms were real, their welcoming hands and words all too convincing. None knew precisely what had transpired in the world above, though many had some surmise to offer. We gathered in council as we had of old, the thoughtful gazes and wise words of Menandros, Hibil-Ziwa, Abramelin, Nectabanus, and all the rest, a welcome delight in these most straitened of times. I jested, apologizing for being the last of us left alive, but Eliadnor of Tyre corrected me, a gleam in his eye once he had brushed a clinging cobweb from it. Nay, brother, you are no straying sheep, but you have returned to the flock. Rather, I should say that the rest of the flock has returned to me, said I, still jovial, but this is not what my friend intended. Abramelin spoke next. Perhaps, old friend, you knew not how very ill you were in these last days. How do you suppose you were able to visit with several of us in spirit and to witness the moment of our returning? Quoth Menandros the Essene, Forsooth, you too became like us. You died, and your soul hastened to join us in the pit of Tophet. But then somewhat intervened, restoring both you and us. Mayhap it was the clemency of the Lord which causeth the prisoner to pine, but which cometh at last. Here the man closed his eyes and lowered his head, meseems, in prayer, but I could no more hold my tongue. Nay, it was not as you suppose, but it was mine own will in working that regathered us here, though I am no less surprised than you at the result. Here I explained to my brethren, all more astonished than hitherto, if that were possible, how we had come to this pass. The appearance of the Son of Man amidst the multitudes of Galilee and Perea was marked with great acclaim. At once he was a sensation, healing both the bodies and the souls of those who sought his ministrations. And as he sought to rid the world of its affliction with evil, he scrupled not to beard the beast of sin in its lair. And it happened one day that Jesus entered a village called Magdalene, and on the street he chanced to recognize some who were highly praised for their righteousness in the synagogues of Bethany, of Capharnaum, of Nazareth, and of Chorazin, and he asked what business brought them here. Now the chief occupation of the men of Magdalene was that of fishing, but none of these men had any employment in that trade. Now one man, dismayed to see Jesus, answered him some false excuse, and so did the next. And Jesus waited and saw where they went in. And he inquired of one of the men of Magdalene of what business might be transacted in that dwelling. And he was told, Yonder is the house of Mary Magdalene, she who is known as the great harlot, who hath grown wealthy on the trade of the nations, for all do come to see her ply her trade. Jesus gazed in the direction of her house, which was large and fronted with Greek pillars, and he said, She seemeth to be the veriest embodiment of Lilith, who causeth God's servants to go astray. And withal Jesus too went to her door and entered, and he began to overturn the tables of those who took payment, and the couches of the harlots. Beaded curtains he seized and wielded as whip-lashes to turn the flute girls and the sinners out half-dressed into the streets, where they were much discomfited. At the ruckus the Magdalene herself emerged from the inner chambers, like Goliath alerted to the arrival of his mortal foe. What have you to do with us, Jesus the Nazarene? I know who you are, O son of dust. And Jesus replied, And likewise do I know thee all too well, Magdalene, for that thou art not the harlot in the brothel, but rather even that very brothel in which 7 wicked spirits cavort despite thee. And he said some words invoking the prophet Elijah, whereupon the Magdalene pitched over in convulsions, as 7 dibbuks fled from her supine form. And as they fled, one knocked over a pair of hanging lamps and set the place ablaze. As Jesus took Mary Magdalene to safety, now in her right mind and free of the band of devils, he spoke these words, So shall the fire of untoward lust at length consume itself. He who has ears, let him hear. Not long afterward these tidings reached my ears, and soon I heard also of the sad passing of my colleague Abramelin. I thought not to connect the 2 events at the time, but upon reflection I was able to determine that the death followed hard upon the heels of the deliverance of the harlot, even in the self-same hour, though many miles removed. And Jesus came with his growing circle of disciples to the house of Simon in Capharnaum, where Simon's daughter had long consumed the resources of the family with lingering illness, for she was sorely crippled since birth. And Simon had told him about her, hoping he might see fit to heal her. But as they entered the house, Simon's mother-in-law told him, Trouble not the teacher the more, for the child is dead. And she wept much, but Simon only looked at Jesus. And Jesus said, Where is the child? And they showed him to the inner room, and he took with him Simon and Andrew and Jacob. And he bent over the girl's twisted form and said to her, I tell you, daughter of Simon, get up. And the girl arose and made to embrace her father. And all rejoiced, save Simon himself, so that Jesus asked him, What troubleth thee, Simon? And Simon replied, averting his gaze, Forsooth, Master, I hoped you might heal her of her affliction as well. Yet she is no better, albeit she lives again. And Jesus said to him, Do you think the Son of Man came to make men's lives easier? Nay, rather harder, for only so may they learn endurance and compassion. This I heard from Simon himself soon afterward, who had in the interval come to accept the wisdom of his Lord. On the same occasion it was Simon who reported to me the death of Hezekiah ben Imlah, another of the 50. He saw no connection. One day Jesus entered a village of Judea, where a beggar approached him from a narrow alley, saying, Jesus the Nazarene, have mercy and heal me. Surely such is the will of God, is it not? Jesus stopped in his way and looked at the man, answering him, It may be, let us see. And he touched the withered leg of the man, who said, I injured it while I slept, I know not how. In a moment his leg was sound like the other, and he went on his way rejoicing, leaping with the very leg that had hobbled him. Now Jesus lingered in that village teaching, and it was not long before men told him of a rash of thefts and burglaries. And Jesus said, Be vigilant, for if the master of the house had known in what hour the thief would come, he would not have suffered him to carry away his goods. And so Jesus himself kept watch that night, and sure enough, he caught a man looking through his things. No longer feigning sleep, he said to the robber, What seek you? Have I not already given you such as I possess?" For in truth it was the lame man he had healed a few days earlier, and at once the man's leg withered up again. "If it is the will of God, it is better to beg from others than to steal from them." I smiled when they repeated the episode to me, but at once my spirit was quenched by the news of another old friend's death, this time Hibil-Ziwa of the Rechabites. I began to fear. When next I met with my brethren of the 50, there was great rejoicing at the seeming success of our endeavor, for they all had heard similar stories, and yet there were fewer gathered than in former days. And as the weeks and months went on, and the fame of Jesus the Nazarene grew, our numbers declined proportionately. If any besides me understood the linkage, they remained as silent as I did, reckoning that the price we were paying was a small one in view of the good we beheld accomplished on all sides. I gladly acquiesced in what seemed to be happening to us, since it was plain that the saving role of the 50 had been transferred to more capable shoulders. The world might go on quite well without a crowd of old men huddling in secret. Our golem would succeed, was succeeding where we had done nothing save to delay the inevitable slide into the abyss. So Jesus increased from strength unto strength, while our number dwindled. Oh, I knew well enough that when all of us whose powers energized him were exhausted and dead, Jesus' own powerful deeds must cease. All things must come to an end. Our wager was that when that time came, Jesus should have effected so much good in the world as to have fended off the advances of darkness and of the evil one. One is so often blinded by the glow of optimism, alas. Little did any of us foresee that as Jesus weakened, leaving miracles behind and devoting more time to teaching his disciples, the crowds would begin to grow colder to him, missing the bread and circuses he had first provided them, as they must have regarded them. At length they should play into the hands of our enemies, Rome and the powers behind their masks, and our defenses spent, the darkness should rally for one last assault. All this came home to me with resistless clarity once all the 50 but myself had passed away, and as I subsequently learned, entered the torment which our blasphemous usurpation of the divine prerogatives had earned us. Once the word arrived that Jesus had been arrested at the olive press of Gethsemane, I knew I must act quickly if there was to be any chance at all of undoing the damage my brethren and I had done. In the silence of the tomb-like cavity beneath Old Jerusalem, I stood without witnesses and chanted softly from the Sefer Yetzirah, seeking to unleash and direct a bolt of the primeval life force like unto that we had at the first release to make the golem stand up. I hoped to revivify the Nazarene at the moment of his death, or as near to it as I might venture. I finished as much of the ritual as I could without anyone to take the antiphonal part. My spirits still low, I crept back the way I had come and retired to my cot, suddenly enervated, and so my fever dreams began. And now I told my friends and fellow workers my spell had gone astray. I had unleashed the power of creation, for which no doubt I should be doubly damned, but I had been a modicum too early, and the effect was unanticipated. Instead, it was the disintegrating forms of the buried 50 which returned to life, creating havoc in the city as they ventured a hesitant return to their accustomed domiciles, then sought refuge in the last place it remained to them, even here. Our Jesus was dead, but we lived, for how long none might say, and no longer could we claim the distinction of the Sanhedrin of the righteous, since we above all other men had transgressed the laws of God, relying upon our own rashness, mistaking it for wisdom. Surely our mere presence in the world could no longer serve to stave off its doom. If anything, we appeared to have hastened it. But then, as the tattered form of Dositheus the Samaritan now observed, Jesus himself had done nothing but good. He could not have attracted to himself the damnation of a righteous God, and where I alone had failed and died, might the restored college of the 50 succeed? Might we not again pool our life forces, our knowledge of the arcane elements, to bring back the Nazarene from the dead? Miracles would likely remain beyond his grasp, but it was evident now that such had never been the strength of his ministry to the heart and the soul in any event. If we could but secure him a few added years in which to complete his teaching, who knew? Perhaps he might succeed in building a new Sanhedrin of 50 righteous. And if he did not, if the world no longer possessed a guarantee of salvation despite its depravity, perhaps that was just as well. Perhaps the children of men would finally understand the gravity of their need. Perhaps the long stalemate of good versus evil, which the cumulative weight of the 50 had only served to maintain in balance, would issue in a final struggle for better or for worse. That might even prove to be the real will of God. With no alternative available, the risen sages agreed to pursue my course, and we made as many of the ritual preparations as we could. The thing took some hours, but at length we were done. At once I left for Golgotha, hoping that I might prevail upon the hegemon Pilate, a man not unknown to me from better times, to let me take charge of the corpse of Jesus, lest it be cast, as seemed likely, into a common lime pit. As I returned to the surface, I mused that I should never more see the 50, that already they must be collapsing again, this time in an unknown tomb that should hide their mysteriously missing corpses forever from the sight of men. Despite the day's tumult, or rather perhaps because of it, the usual official barriers were easier to make one's way around, and finally I gained audience with Pilate. He was thoroughly exhausted with the strange business of the day. He had heard the superstitious rumors and sought to calm the fears of those who spread them, applying force as needed, and he was most heartily sick of it. With my request scarcely out of my mouth, he waived his permission and dismissed me with a paper hastily inscribed by one of his attendant scribes. I needed but give it to the centurion on duty, and he would assign a soldier to carry the body to my own nearby tomb. Once the body of Jesus lay prone on the stone shelf of the tomb, I gave it a cursory examination, and then noticed the torn flesh on the forehead. At first mistaking it for another wound of the thorny crown, I soon recognized the incidental effacement of the crucial letter, without which the mark of divine truth had changed to the mute seal of death. I was no surgeon, nor had I any tools to repair the wound, but I felt that the flesh of the golem had begun to return, almost imperceptibly, to its original clay, something I had not anticipated. So it was a simple matter merely to smooth the flesh and reinscribe the torn letter. And at once the skin was warm again beneath my fingertips. His eyes opened. His mouth said one word, "Joseph." Then his glowing eyes blinked, and he spoke again. "I am he that liveth and was dead." I put my finger against his lips and whispered, "No, master, not now. I have but little time. You may not have much more, and we have much to accomplish. Let us go forth." Where, you may wonder, did they go? Allegro said he had bought the manuscript from a trader. Many of the Dead Sea Scrolls came into scholarly hands that way, not from an Arab smuggler, but from an antiquities dealer who swore the thing came from Nepal. Make of it what you will.